Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all our participants tonight. My name is Linda Steinberg, and I'm the president of the National Council of Jewish Women of Canada, an organization with a proud 127-year history. Our mission at NCJWC is to drive social change through education. And in line with this mandate, our Antisemitism Committee, chaired by Eva Karpati, has developed a webinar series highlighting women who are actively combating antisemitism around the globe. This evening, we are honored to welcome Dr. Joan Lurie, speaking on this very timely topic. Antisemitism is rampant since October 7th. What can we do at the UN and in the diaspora? Dr. Joan Lurie is a dynamic physicist and a passionate advocate for peace and justice. With over a decade of experience representing the International Council of Jewish Women at the United Nations, Dr. Lurie is a powerful voice on the global stage. As co-chair of the Jewish NGOs, called JNGOs caucus, she is leading the charge in the campaign UNRWA Stop Teaching Hate, aiming to reform the education system for Palestinian children. Joan is also the VP of the newly formed NGO Committee End Antisemitism and Promote Peace. Dr. Lurie embodies leadership in action, driving change, promoting peace, and standing firmly against anti-Semitism. Before I give the floor to Dr. Lurie, I'd just like to remind everyone to stay muted and to enter your questions into the chat. And Eva Karpati will be helping to moderate the chat. Joan?
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for that very elegant introduction. Everybody can please call me Joan. We can drop the doctor. We're all friends here. I have been at the UN in New York for 15 years. Everything else I would tell you about that would be repeating what Linda said, so I won't say it. But my topic is daunting. Anti-Semitism at the UN and in the diaspora since October 7th. That's really tricky, but hopefully we will learn more about what it's all like. So let me just say good evening to most of you, and I hope good morning to a couple of Australians who are supposed to be on, but I don't know if they are or not. So before I begin, some observations on the determination the world has to obliterate the Jewish state. Golda Meir, as usual, was right on target. She said, "We will have peace as soon as the Palestinians love their children more than they hate us." Unfortunately, we have made no progress toward that goal. They want their children to be martyred by killing Jews, so that's that. The Israeli worldview has been changed and diminished by this awful war. An author, Dorit Rebengen, said, and I quote, "We used to be Israelis. Now we are Jews." I think that's a very profound statement that has to do with a lot of the sense of what Israelis feel about their country. And the third comment, the third generalized comment, all of us have to learn that we must learn to listen to what Arab leaders say when they're speaking in Arabic. What they say when they're prettied up in English is not what they really mean. I know because people translate Arabic for me. Hamas, for example, says they will keep fighting Israel forever. They'll never relent until they have all the land from the river to the sea. And they say that, and this is very pointed, after they defeat Israel, they will proceed to other Western democracies. So right now, little tiny Israel, with its very brave soldiers, is fighting for all of us in this world on a front with 7 different Iranian proxies. Danny Danon is the current ambassador from Israel to the UN. He just returned for a second term. He had been the ambassador until a few years ago. and he gave an opening speech. He said, the UN is different than when he left, and he left about 4 years ago, and he is representing a different Israel fighting a war on 7 fronts. The October 7th atrocities wiped out whole families of innocent Israelis. Unspeakable evil was committed at a kibbutz named Nir Oz, several others also, but that's the one he knows. Many Israeli soldiers have been wounded or killed, and people are still out of their homes because they're not safe. The country in many ways, and I was just there a few months ago, so I believe this, is still in shock. Any human being, any real human being would support Israel. But after 300 days of this war, the UN is still silent on condemning Hamas. That alone is enough to tell you we have a UN problem. To me, this is the ultimate example of anti-Semitism, and it's not new at the UN. It's been going on for a long time. I have to remark on a personal note that I'm sad beyond belief at all these unnecessary deaths of innocent Jews. It's like the world never leaves us alone. These were peace-loving people whose neighbors had never let them live in peace for even a single day since the state was founded in 1948. In spite of everything, Israel has thrived, as we all know. And her very brave soldiers are courageous and fight very hard and know perfectly well that Israel is the only homeland they have. On September 11th this year, just 11 months after October 7th, we were reminded that the same Islamist terror that shook our country, at my city, 22 decades ago, continues to destroy innocent lives today. So wherever I go, people said, so what can women do? My first answer is very close to something Linda was saying about the mission of NCJW Canada, namely education. I still believe, as bad as things are, more people learning more about the kind of education going on at the UN, and you know, most of you know I talk about that all the time, so such people would be less inclined to follow the latest pro-Hamas demonstration. So October 7th was an Israeli intelligence failure, resulting in a brutal attack, 1,200 deaths, 250 hostages dragged back to Gaza. And by the way, the hostage issue was something I'm not speaking about tonight because there was no time. So we must learn more, and we must make people understand better what's going on. Some of the terrorists were young kids who were so excited they called their parents to brag about how many Jews they had killed. And one father said, and I heard this recording with my own ears, said to his son, keep it up. So we obviously have a problem. October 7th, after a very few days of sympathy for Israel, maybe not even a week, led to the worst explosion of Jew hatred since the Holocaust. Certainly in my life, this is the worst Jew hatred I've ever seen. Has anyone forgotten that the war began with a vicious, murderous attack on Israel by terrorists from Gaza? This is an existential war which Israel must win. For me, it's the first time in 7 decades of being a Zionist that I actually fear for the survival of the state of Israel and the people who live there. At the same moment, numerous countries are cutting off arms sales to Israel in protest of Israel's behavior in the war. Another idea which I hope to debunk in the next few minutes. And yet, Israel's behavior is very moral. I'm sure we've all heard that Gazans are starving. But there was just an expose in one of the Jewish newspapers that the reason Gazans are starving is because Hamas is stealing the contents of all the relief aid trucks. So Israel, which most countries wouldn't do with people who want to kill them, has been pouring aid into Gaza, and the Hamas fighters come, take it off the truck, and put it in a warehouse. And the reason this got to be known was because the warehouse overflowed with too much food. I mean, it's absurd, really, but that's what happened. So the other thing that's really good to hear, but it doesn't do us much good right now, several military figures have looked into statistics that show that the IDF remains the world's most moral army. In other words, for the type of urban warfare they have to engage in, they are killing fewer civilians than most armies would kill. Now, that's a whole other subject because, in fact, who's a civilian in Gaza turns out to be a very subtle question. We'll go into that in a few minutes. So, what's our responsibility as a Jewish women's organization at the UN? No doubt UN anti-Semitism has driven the terrorists to be bold and destructive. Early in the war, Hezbollah began firing rockets into the north of Israel from Lebanon. That had nothing to do with the beginning of the war, right? Would that have happened if Hezbollah felt that the UN was against the war and worried about protecting Israel? I don't think so. So this anti-Semitism is a sort of sick loop. The role of the UN should definitely concern us. Netanyahu has defined the 3 Ds of the UN's philosophy: demonize, delegitimize, and double standards for Israel. Why do I think the UN is so important that I'm wasting your time on it tonight? That's another question. A few months ago, I was on a mission in Israel run by Shirat Hadin, and the first speaker was Mark Regev, R-E-G-E-V, who was the ambassador of Israel to the United Kingdom about 4 years ago. He said that when he's asked why Israel's public relations is so much less successful than Palestinian public relations, he had a frightening answer. Listen closely. It's a quote. 99% of the world's population is sure the UN is the best thing on earth. Furthermore, they believe the Secretary General is the equivalent of a secular pope. And he's given this speech everywhere, and I think he's got something going there, because how can you possibly compete for publicity with a group that people literally worship when you're a tiny little country full of Jews? So, and of course, getting any accurate reporting out of Gaza is a joke, because the Palestinians in Gaza beat up any journalist who says anything bad about Hamas. One guy, in fact, got out of Gaza just a few weeks ago. He was transferred by Israel to the UAE to recover from the beating. And he said it was the first time he felt safe in years. So obviously, we don't have a chance of getting any accurate information. So let's start at the top here and talk about the UN's actions against Israel. Secretary General Guterres, the present Secretary General, said this on October 24th, 2 weeks after the war started. Attacks by Hamas were appalling, but did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Well, Israel got out of Gaza in 2007, so there's no 56 years there. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. They have seen their land devoured by settlements and plagued by violence. Did this really come from a Secretary General? The envoy to the UN at that time, Gilad Erdan, called on Guterres to resign, accusing him of being detached from reality. But of course, he didn't resign. So that's the kind of thing we're dealing with at the very top level. More recently, Guterres said, and I found this statement totally unbelievable, that he is not concerned at all about the hostages. It's not part of his worldview. I bet if the hostages weren't Jewish, he'd be worried about them. So we have to try to spread the kind of stuff coming out of the UN more in more places. Some people are doing a pretty good job of it, but we still need to do a little better. To show you how far the UN goes to ignore any what you and I would call tsuris of Jewish people, a recent incident shows what they think. An exhibit about terrorism was set up in the hallway leading to the place where tours begin. So every single tourist who came to the UN was going to see a huge exhibit about terror attacks, but not one thing about the Hamas terror attack on October 7th, which killed 1,200 Jews. No mention whatsoever. Surely the UN treatment of Hamas must embolden anti-Jewish demonstrations everywhere. And now, if my husband will share his screen, you'll see a film about this. You're going to have to read it because he's speaking Hebrew.
והנה מחר, האו"ם מציין את היום הבינלאומי לזיכרון קורבנות הטרור, ויהיו כאן דיונים רמי דרג, יש כאן אפילו תערוכה ממש בכניסת המבקרים, כדי להזכיר לכולנו את קורבנות הטרור מהפיגועים ברחבי העולם. יש כאן פיגועים שמוכרים לנו, כמו 9/11, בוסטון, פיגועים שהתרחשו באינדונזיה, בקניה ועוד ועוד. אבל מה אין כאן? אין כאן שום פיגוע שבוצע על ידי פלסטינים כנגד ישראלים. חברים, אנחנו עוד מעט מציינים שנה לטבח ולפיגוע הטרור הכי גדול שבוצע ביהודים וישראלים מאז השואה. אבל האו"ם לא חושב שזה צריך להיות מוצג כאן על הקירות של האו"ם. אבל מה כן האו"ם הצליח למצוא? הפתעה, הצליחו למצוא פלסטינית, קורבן טרור, באופן מטעה כתוב פה פלסטיין כדי שיחשבו שהיא נפגעה בישראל, אבל כשקוראים את האותיות הקטנות, מסתבר שהיא בכלל נפגעה בפיגוע בניו זילנד. אז לכן אני אומר, חברים, אין מקום יותר רקוב ומעוות מוסרית מאשר האו"ם, וכולנו חייבים להתאחד, להסביר זאת בכל הרחבי העולם, לדרוש את סגירת ופירוק המקום הזה, ופתיחת גוף חדש שמייצג באמת ערכים נעלים.
Okay, I'm back. And I agree with every word he said. That was probably the last speech he gave before he left his position as ambassador and was replaced by Danny Danon, who you'll hear a little bit more about later. But this guy didn't mince any words. He told them exactly what he thought. He was terrific. Okay, that's just the tip of the UN attitude. Now we get to my favorite subject, which I tend to bore people to death with, but I'll try to be brief. What is UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, in existence since 1949 with the mission of helping Palestinian refugees, educating them, and so on and so forth? Now you want to know how come Hamas had so little trouble finding so many fighters to start this October 7th affair. The world should never again be able to deny the effect of an education backed by terror. The story of UNRWA should be told to everyone. I'm going to give you a warning. We're going to find later that UNRWA is a small part of the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic UN superstructure, but it's still clear from many instances of the war that UNRWA is tightly wired to Hamas. And a lot of mainstream press says that's garbage. It was made up by this one or that one. But one of the people who I'll thank at the end of this has studied it very carefully. And they're absolutely right. You can't walk the streets of Gaza and tell me who's Hamas and who's UNRWA. So let's get back to this issue of civilians getting hurt in the war. If Mr. Joe Schmo is a teacher employed by UNRWA, and he also keeps hostages in his apartment, which many of them did, is he a civilian? I don't think so. So it's very hard to know what's going on, which is probably on purpose. In any case, I'm going to try to stay away from a long tale about the education, but a couple of things you have to know. UNRWA's own bylaws committed to neutrality and mandate that they not take sides. And they do take sides, of course. They presumably were supposed to resettle these refugees, but they never resettled even one refugee. If you are a Palestinian refugee and you become a United States citizen, like one of our congresswomen, you remain also a refugee. And she collects income and everything. So why do we have so many refugees, estimated now at 5 million? There were never 5 million people living in Gaza and the West Bank. That's ridiculous. But unlike all other refugee agencies in the world, including the rest of the UN, UNRWA has made refugee status an inherited characteristic. There are more than 5 million descendants of the original 700,000 refugees who were registered in 1950, most of whom are no longer living. So, UNRWA has over 30,000 employees, a budget of $1.6 billion, and 13,000 of those employees work in Gaza, in 300 facilities run by UNRWA. Some of them right over weapons depots of Hamas. Not a single refugee's been resettled, as I said. And so more than half of a $1.6 billion budget each year goes to so-called education. I call it military terrorism training, but they call it education. The really ugly part that you're going to see a film about shortly is in the summer camps that UNRWA runs. And if you want to have a little kid and you want to go to summer camp, you take him and you apply, or her, him or her, and apply for a place. These children can be as young as 10. They're given weapons with live ammunition. They practice crawling around on the ground with rifles, aimed at pretend Jews and so on and so forth. Clearly, this is not a peaceful summer camp, like when you send your kids to swim in the lake. Okay, we're going to show a film in a couple of minutes. It's a photograph, sorry. It's a picture of a summer camp from 2021. So most of these kids could very well have been available for Hamas to use on October 7th. David Badin is among the most dedicated researchers. He spent 30 years of his life on UNRWA. I sometimes feel like I've spent 10 of mine, but he's spent 30. And what he does is he raises money. And believe it or not, there are lots of Palestinian journalists, especially ones who are Israeli citizens, who are very sympathetic to people who think like I think. And they can walk into these refugee camps and take pictures, because they look like Palestinians, right? So why would anybody think they were spies? So he gets some really good pictures, and you're going to see one, well, you're going to see a brief clip right now. Jean, you awake?
الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
واحنا جيل فلسطين، احنا بنعشق الشهادة.
والله احنا بنجاهد عشان القدس وعشان وطننا ونموت شهداء.
هاي جيل التحرير، بنحرر فلسطين والقدس وكل الدول المحتلة.
جاي اتدرب عشان احارب اليهود لما اكبر وندافع عن القدس وعن فلسطين.
نتدرب ونستعد لأي حرب جاية، لأن نحن الجيل الجديد الذي يعود لأرضه، وسنحرر الأقصى بإذن الله.
the world has witnessed every year over the past decade, UNRWA students, even those who have not yet finished elementary school, are lured to participate in summer camps for armed guerrilla warfare. Allah! Allah! These children, who should expect UNRWA to provide a normal summer vacation environment, fall prey to terror groups that lurk everywhere, or are sent to these programs by their own parents. This summer, armed operatives signed up tens of thousands of UNRWA students ages 10 to 17 for summer camps offering extensive military training. Recruitment took place in mosques and at registration tables throughout the Gaza Strip.
إن صراعنا مع عدونا هو صراع على الجيل ومن يكسب الجيل في النهاية يكسب المعركة.
دربونا شوية نتعامل مع التيس الشرس النتنياهو ونفتالي بنات وحط القمنا على البرغوث ونفتالي بنات يا رب يموت. دستوركم سبيلكم أسمع منيكم.
Thank you. I'm back. I think I'm going to skip the next chart or two because I had a lot of details about the education, but I think you must understand by watching that film what their education must be like. They have books full of ways to kill Jews, and the war of return is a really popular subject. All the new textbooks published since 2020, I guess, insist there will be a war of return and they will have everything from the river to the sea. So this is how we got started. A group of us at the UN called ourselves UNRWA Stop Teaching Hate, and we started working with people all over the world to raise awareness. Since October 7th, this topic has gotten a lot more attention, and we feel sort of vindicated, although there's no real result yet. We still have UNRWA. So if you study the books, I believe that the path to peace begins in the classroom, but not in these classrooms, believe me, because these classrooms prepare the kids for what you just saw. So why UNRWA should be abolished? I think you've got a pretty good idea already that UNRWA should be abolished. There are 13,000 UNRWA workers in Gaza, most of them teaching kids to behave like you just saw. This has been going on for over 70 years, so the teachers had the same education. And UNRWA employees, now this is where many people don't agree with me, but I see this as a complete merging of UNRWA and Hamas. UNRWA teachers support the terrorists. 3,000 of them celebrated the October 7th massacre by throwing sweets to the children in the streets. So that was UNRWA. UNRWA's Lebanese union head is a top figure in Hamas. The workers became human shields for Hamas. And most important, because we have testimony now, many of the hostages were tortured and starved in apartments belonging to United Nations employees from UNRWA, people whose salary is paid, at least 25% of their salary is paid by us, the United States of America.
Isn't that nice?
So, and the terror tunnels, of course, go in and out of UNRWA buildings. So that's definitely not even news anymore. Does this make sense that there should be such a tight bond? The Jews working near the Gaza border hired many Arab day laborers. They trusted these people extraordinarily. They even let them draw maps of their houses. Those people were all terrorists. I think that it's very unlikely that degree of trust will come back in a hurry. So that's why we think that UNRWA should be hopefully dissolved. It would be the best thing. But at least at this point, the Director General is being sued by a group of lawyers, partly from Israel, partly from the United States. I know some of them, but they're not talking very much about how they hope to go about this. But he is being sued for violations of the rights of the child and that kind of thing because of the training the soldiers. So maybe something will come of that. The whole business of using young kids to do this October 7th atrocity is a violation of the rights of the child and the UN Charter. At one point, the same ambassador who you heard talk about the exhibit actually shredded the UN Charter on television while he explained why he thinks the UN Charter should be shredded. And this was basically the topic. So, UNRWA is only the beginning of a huge UN apparatus to delegitimize and defame Israel while supporting Palestinians. UNRWA must go. One of the best conversations I ever had with an Israeli was about 3 words. I was on a lunch line at a reception with Danny Danon, who was the present ambassador of Israel to the UN. And he asked me what I did, and I told him we were trying to expose UNRWA, and his quote was, "Go get him, girl." So I decided he was a good guy. In 70 years, they've never resettled a refugee. We said that already. But the UN has created many more organizations, and now it becomes a follow the money problem. So much money is being spent on this apparatus. There's committees, there's a commission of inquiry whose only goal is to look into evil things that Israel has done. It was started by a woman who some of you may have heard of named Navi Pillay, one of the most notorious anti-Semites in the world. And every year they make a report, they have a huge budget, and this commission of inquiry was started in 2021 with an infinite lifetime, no limit on how long they investigate. Every year they report on the latest bad things they think Israel has done. And then, of course, in Geneva, that's all in New York. In Geneva, we have the Human Rights Council, which Israel is the only country in the world with a standing agenda item to investigate its mistreatment of Palestinians. No other country is automatically investigated every year, only Israel. So anti-Israel resolutions are also passed by the General Assembly, UNESCO, lots of other agencies and committees. It's a disease that permeates the entire UN. So the next subject I want to just touch on a little bit because it's become so current, the famous two-state solution, the question of statehood for Palestinians. A month ago, I wouldn't have been talking about this. I've been talking about some other atrocity, but this has gotten so bad. Right now, the Palestinians have managed to increase their status to the point where even though nobody knows where any inch of Palestine is located, okay, somehow or other, they have become a member state. And they're able to go to the General Assembly, make resolutions, and so on. They've made it crystal clear that they're engaged in a war of return in which they're going to seize every square foot. The two-state solution, as we define it, is not feasible. You can't have one state making a two-state solution. And the Palestinians have refused every offer of a state ever given to them, probably 9 or 10 times by now, between 1948 and the Oslo Accords in 93. So I'm sure you've heard from your, well, I don't know about Canadian politicians, but I know Americans have heard from our politicians that in spite of all this, we must support a two-state solution. They have no idea what the other state's going to say or do, because there is no other state. Israel would definitely want to have a two-state solution. There's no question. They've offered land for peace over and over again. When Trump was president, he came up with a scheme. Instead of land for peace, he was going to give them peace for land. But they vote everything down and they go away and bomb something. So all offers have been refused. And if that's really the only way out of this war, we're in big trouble. but it's a fairy tale. You can't have a two-state solution unless the Israelis and the Palestinians agree. That's an axiom of my thinking. There's just no other way to do it. The UN is trying to do it unilaterally. They're trying to give them a unilateral gift of statehood, excuse me, which at this point seems like it's a gift to reward terrorism. And it's getting worse and worse because every day they get more rights. In April, the Security Council voted on whether to recommend the GA approve membership admission for the Palestinians. And luckily, we vetoed it. The United States vetoed it, and the UK and Switzerland abstained. But as our deputy UN ambassador said, this vote doesn't reflect opposition to Palestinian statehood, and this is important, but instead is an acknowledgement that you can only get Palestinian statehood from direct negotiations between both parties, which of course they won't do. In June, however, in spite of the veto in the Security Council, the state of Palestine was recognized as a sovereign state by the General Assembly. That means they can do everything except vote in the GA and be elected as officers of the GA. They can make motions and speak on all agenda items. 145 out of 193 members voted in favor of this nonsense. I mean, I think it's appalling. I know people like to work at the UN in New York because it's nicer than Timbuktu or wherever they come from, but I can't believe that 145 member states would vote in favor. The ambassador, who is now Danny Danon, protested that the PA supports terror. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I left that out. The person representing the Palestinian state is a man named Mansour who works at the Palestinian Authority. So the ambassador protested that the PA supports terror with pay to slay and doesn't recognize Israel as a state. So again, this is just a situation that emboldens the rejectionism of the Palestinians. We do have to listen to them when they speak in Arabic. The UN appears to understand that and cooperate with it. And it just gets worse, just a little worse. On the 18th of September, that's yesterday, and this is really frightening, the GA, so we couldn't veto it, voted to strip Israel of the right to self-defense in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, based on the International Court of Justice advisory opinion in July, which said that that occupation was illegal. Guterres says he supports this, which is not good either. Danny Danon says Palestinians are waging diplomatic terror and the UN is complicit. It's a new moral low. Now, according to what they voted on, we have to hope this won't happen, the IDF has to withdraw to pre-1967 lines within 12 months. And the resolution calls on states to stop selling arms to Israel. So if this is taken literally by these 145 states, we are really in big trouble. I mean, I can't see any way out of that. The UN has been totally silent, by the way, never once condemned Hamas. So it's really a sad world we live in. In fact, I wrote, indeed, the world is nuts, and the UN is the leader of the nuts. So if you have some questions, I think we should wait till about 10 minutes after I do the other piece. But we should see the other movie, I think. Yeah, Jean, I think we should see the other movie now because we're going to move on to the Diaspora. This is a much more recent movie, as you'll see, and it's going to be brief because I'm going to tell them to turn it off after a few minutes. This is UNRWA at War, And this is
On October
2024.
7th, some 3,000 Hamas terrorists invaded Israel. By the end of the day, they had slaughtered some 1,200 people. Victims were shot, stabbed, burned alive, and raped. The terrorists also kidnapped some 250 people, including the bodies of people they had killed, and dragged them back to the Gaza Strip. While the world was surprised by the attack, the truth is that Hamas had been preparing to strike against Israel in this way for decades. Hamas is a militant Islamic fundamentalist movement that has run the Gaza Strip since 2007. In that time, jihad, or holy war, has been its primary concern, the goal being Israel's destruction. For more than 20 years, Iran has spent billions to train and supply Hamas and help it build a network of tunnels to prepare for its war against Israel. Yet Iranian weapons are only part of the story. Hamas, with its iron grip on the Gaza Strip, has inculcated a noxious mix of anti-Semitism, militant Islamic theology, and nationalism to gain the support of the population. The crux of its ideology is the destruction of Israel and the demonization of Jews, whom adherents consider subhuman. Once Israel is destroyed, Hamas members and other Palestinians aspire to activate the so-called right of return, which would allow them to settle in cities that are currently in Israel. At the center of the October 7th attack was an unlikely source of funding and manpower. It came from a shadowy United Nations organization called UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The name sounds innocuous, but in truth, the agency, which has received billions and billions of US dollars, has become an arm of Hamas. Its unions are led by high-ranking Hamas officials. In its schools and in its curriculum, UNRWA teaches hundreds of thousands of children that Israel is an illegitimate state that should be destroyed. This would allow the right of return to be implemented. Instead of instilling peace into the Palestinian population, UNRWA nurtures war in its school system. At UNRWA schools, education is not limited to texts and is not confined to the classroom. Inside schoolyards, students pass by violent graffiti that glorifies killers. One of the Palestinian heroes is Dalal Mughrabi, whose image adorns alleyways near UNRWA schools and neighborhoods. In 1978, she led a terror gang that commandeered a bus and murdered 38 passengers, including 13 children. On the paths of UNRWA camps, children speak about Mughrabi with awe and reverence.
صور شهداء سووا عمليات إن سووا عمليات لأجل الوطن يعني دلال المغربي سوت عملية تفجير وفجرت حالها عند الجيش يعني زي أختي وأمي بنت بلدي.
دلال المغربي هي شهيدة فلسطينية شردت فجرت اليهود وهجرتهم.
UNRWA schools portray Mughrabi as a role model. In its current curriculum, Mughrabi's photo appears in a study book for third graders. It is a key lesson in Our Beautiful Language, a new textbook issued in 2019. On page 63, pupils learn to chant the land of the nobles. The assignment calls for kids to liberate Palestine and to exterminate the current residents of Israel, the Jews. Here they chant the song in the classroom.
Jean, I think we should stop here because we're running behind. Can you stop? Thank you. Anyway, I just thought you should get a feel for what's happening now, so that's why I put that film in there. David just made it this July with 3 guys he managed to hire and had them go and take these pictures. So now to the diaspora and anti-Semitism. Within a week, the sympathy for Israel disappeared, and there was ever-increasing anti-Semitism all over the world, not just in New York at the UN, even in so-called civilized places. The nations of the UN have relentlessly bashed this light unto the nations, which happily has led to some excellent and effective grassroots actions, which I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about in our last few minutes before we go to Q&A. Clearly, we didn't expect this to happen in a post-Holocaust world, but this anti-Semitism was not invented on October 7th. It was invented 2,000 years ago. After the Holocaust, it was sort of sleeping a little bit, but people were ashamed and silent about their own anti-Semitism. And then they got this opportunity to break loose. Every place they looked, someone was bashing Israel or yelling, "Long live Hamas," or "From the river to the sea." Some reporter in New York stopped a kid and said, "What river, what sea?" The kid had no idea. I mean, these are people who just want to be in the streets saying, "I hate Jews." So after Hamas attacked Israel, they were no longer ashamed. The social media handling of the Hamas war forgot who started it and blamed Israel for everything. There are 10 statements I could read to you that you never thought you'd hear in America, or Canada for that matter. There are anti-Semites in Congress. Jews, you would never have thought this would happen. Jews are beaten in the streets of New York, LA, and other major cities. Synagogues are vandalized with Nazi symbols. Windows of Jewish homes have been shattered. And maybe most important of all, US colleges are limiting the movement of Jewish students and telling them to live with harassment. Restaurants can refuse to serve Jews, and Jews leaving kosher restaurants are often harassed. Thousands march through the streets, holding and wrapped in flags of terror organizations dedicated to the annihilation of Jews. U.S. courts have been forcing academic institutions to not discriminate against Jews, but not very successfully. The faculty of major U.S. colleges insists that, and I quote, I don't understand how you get this, U.S. colleges insist that anti-Semitism on campus depends on context. What context? Who knows? You would just have laughed, but all these things are happening now, and it seems to be getting worse. Just have a few minutes left, but there is a lot of evidence of a rapid explosion of anti-Semitism, and it's gotten down to a very personal level. I had 2 conversations, one with a Canadian, one with an American. One with a Canadian, one with a New Zealander, who had cross-religious groups, friendly women's chat groups that were partly Muslim, partly Jewish. In New Zealand, it was Maoris and Muslims and Jews. And guess what? Everybody stopped showing up except the Jews. So there was a little bit of goodwill that might have been happening, was killed by this. And why not? I mean, the newspapers, the UN, everybody thinks it's all just terrific. So do you know that you can't mention the 10 Commandments in some schools because it's too controversial? But Minneapolis just became the first major US city to broadcast the call to prayer 5 times a day for the Muslims. So it's really pretty awful. Anti-Semitic attacks in the streets have led to events in France that has French rabbis telling the Jews to prepare to leave the country. France is not a stranger to this type of anti-Semitism, but they do see it growing a lot. Because I have a couple of friends in France. There's nobody here from Europe tonight because it's the middle of the night. But I've talked to these people. Anyway, silence can be complicity. And that's really been a problem. Because, for example, I didn't mention this in the UN part, but the murder, torture, and abduction committed against Jewish women on October 7 was not mentioned at the UN. UN women that's supposed to defend every female on earth never mentioned it. Finally, there was a program in December due to the thanks to the Israel mission and a few very prominent women, including Hillary Clinton, and it took place at the UN, where all of this was described. It was one of the few positive things I saw in the first few months. So hate speech laws can be ignored by companies. The Meta, the Facebook company, is doing a beautiful job of ignoring their very own hate speech laws. I'm not going to go into it, but I would like to talk a few minutes about colleges and universities because I have two interesting connections there. First of all, how did this happen so soon and so efficiently? The faculty and students at the City University of New York, which used to be a haven for Jewish students. I don't know if Canadians are aware of this, but it's true. They have been getting rid of the Jews for over 15 years. They stopped recruiting students from Jewish schools. They stopped hiring Jewish administrators. They can't do too much about the faculty because most of them are tenured. But Jeffrey Lax, who I know quite well, he's a CUNY administrator, and he said their administration is totally Judenrein. There are no Jews left at all in the administration of the whole university. Most of the sit-ins, especially at City College, there's evidence that there are outside agitators participating, but it almost doesn't matter. They've already achieved what they wanted. There are no Jews. At one college, and I don't know which one this is, at one university, there was a proposal to condemn Hamas, okay? The proposal failed, and the people proposing it were accused of genocide. Now, is that twisted or is that twisted? It's unbelievable. And there are some horrible examples at Columbia. Any person appearing to be Jewish and crossing 116th Street is likely to be assaulted. That's nice, etc. So the president there deserved to lose a job, and she did. And one of the students I talked to, excuse me, said that he fears there may be I don't know if this is a word, a de-Judification of Columbia. Excuse me. I'd like to conclude with some good news. Namely, what can we do? Well, we can encourage police interference when campuses are blocked and Jewish students are bullied. We can send letters. A congressman from Indiana sent a letter this August to 136 college presidents, pressing them on the steps they plan to take to ensure that anti-Israel encampments don't happen this year. So God bless them. But I just want to take 2 minutes per friend. I have two great friends who are involved in this. My friend Elise became an activist after noting the relentless bashing of this light unto the nations. She said she was catapulted into action she never thought would be necessary in a post-Holocaust world. She's involved in probably half a dozen really big organizations, and she has the most wonderful letter writing campaign going constantly on her list, which I get 12 of a day. And she's had some real victories. One of them is the New School in New York. The Student Senate attempted to pressure the university to divest from Israel, and the intent was just based on Jew hatred. A barrage of letters to the school's administration led the administration to override the attempt, which is a big victory. In Virginia, they have a law that says that anyone 16 and over is prohibited from wearing a face covering as a way to hide their identity in public. Well, guess who was hiding their identity that way? You got one guess. So there was a whole big fight about it on campus and a massive letter writing campaign. This is a quote from my friend Elise. caused the university to revise the masking policy in accordance with Virginia law. In other words, the university said, we're free, we don't have to obey that law, but they did. And then at McGill in Canada, the B'nai B'rith student government revoked the status of an anti-Israel group, partly from a letter-writing campaign that Elise and some of her friends started. So there are lots of other cases where speeches were canceled if they were by Jew haters. The Marriott hotel chain seems to have a habit of promising some anti-Jewish maniac that he can talk. And if somebody gets wind of it and they get enough letters, they cancel the speech, which is a good thing. Then this is a young lady who's the daughter of a friend of mine. She's a university student who's very much an activist. And she works for 2 separate organizations at her college and addresses a whole bunch of stuff. She emphasizes that people working in colleges need to listen to the students. Many times adults don't do that. So the fact that students on her own campus have to listen to say it loud, say it clear, Zionism is not welcome here. So she's trying to get that stopped, but she hasn't had any success yet. Zionist students, however, are being attacked. And that's much more serious because, you know, you're little, your mother probably said sticks and stones can break your bones, but nobody can hurt you just by yelling at you. So it's really kind of tough. My friend goes to Tufts and she says Tufts and Columbia are very similar. They both have liberal traditions and it's very hard to keep this stuff down. But she works very hard with an organization called Jewish on Campus, which specializes in students that have almost no, colleges that have almost no Jews, so they can make those kids feel a little more comfortable. And then she works with Chabad and the Israel on Campus Coalition. So her first year, she was really unhappy because she felt like she was being bullied herself. But now she seems to have fallen into a really good role at Tufts, and hopefully she's doing something. She's trying to get them to adopt the IRA definition. And then the victory at McGill I mentioned. And I think that's about it. So if you want me to take a few questions, I can certainly do that.
Great, Joan, that's astounding. I think we're all pretty overwhelmed with your presentation. But I'd like to ask everyone if you're okay with staying on for a few more minutes. I know we wanted this to be an hour, but Joan, you filled us with so much information that if everyone's okay, we'll just take a few more minutes. And Joan, if you don't mind wielding these questions, that would be wonderful.
Oh, I don't mind at all. In fact, I already saw a question. I have to apologize because I didn't have the answer and I can't get it till sometime tomorrow, probably. People want to know what the number is of the resolution giving the Palestinians this new status in the General Assembly. And I didn't see it in the articles. I read 3 different articles, but I will find out. So I'm writing myself a note about that one.
Yeah, well, and to that point, I know there were questions about links to the films as well. So perhaps in our follow-up to everyone, we'll provide that information, Joan. So if you pass it on to Linda, then we will certainly share it with everyone, including the links to the videos.
Oh, and I see somebody wants to know where she can see the full video. I can send that out too.
Yeah, so that's what I'll do, Joan, is we'll send it out to everyone who was present today, if you share it with us. So we'll do that. Thank you so much. So,
and then I have to answer this one question because it really bothers me.
You go ahead.
What should be mentioned is that a substantial number of the General Assembly are Muslim countries. Well, so what? Do you really think that whole country, I mean, they may be, but you think whole countries of Muslims are Nazis who want to murder Jews? I hope not. I mean, maybe it's true. Maybe they're afraid to vote against Hamas. I don't know. But I really don't count which countries are Muslim or Catholic or Jewish or whatever. All I know is there's only one Jewish country. Oh, anything else that you particularly want answered?
Well, there was a question by Patty Carlson, who's actually a member of our National Anti-Semitism Committee, and she asked, is there not an international alliance of democracies that can intervene to educate the Gazan children? So that sense of, where are the voices, and
Why aren't
the
they doing it?
democracies, are they doing anything?
I have to tell you that in doing the research for this talk, I ran into so many instances of people who are really optimists. They really think we can solve this problem by getting, they said, somewhere from 4 to 10 Western countries to get together and give arguments against this garbage that the UN is perpetrating. But it's not happening. And I heard a talk by an absolutely brilliant guy, and he said when he hears politicians from America or England or whatever say that on the day after the war, the famous day after, the Palestinian Authority should take over Gaza, he says he knows that's ridiculous. They're just as bad as Hamas. What he sees, but he's an optimist compared to most of us, he says, give him 5 years and he'll find Palestinian scholars, journalists, etc., that will help to reverse this kind of thinking on the part, right now it's just an automatic, I'm born a Palestinian, I hate the Jews. But you can't change the whole education system in 15 minutes. But you could try to get people who are willing to do it. And then he thinks you could maybe put a new reformed Palestinian Authority in charge in Gaza. But he estimates it would take a minimum of 5 years. So one of the things I left out was I used to say that every morning when I wake up, I know peace is 25 years away, because we'll never have peace till we educate a full generation of Palestinians. And these are smart people. I mean, they're not stupid. So that's a real issue. And there's my favorite character in this whole drama is the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahum, who has actually tried the following little trick. She's gone into elementary schools in East Jerusalem, traded out these horrible books that we've been talking about, and given the students the same books that Palestinian citizens of Israel use in Arab towns, okay? Which, teach a little Hebrew, teach a little English, more important, teach things so maybe these kids could get a job other than shooting people. And you know what happened? The parents came and thanked her, told her how wonderful it was. And 2 weeks later, they told her to take the books away because Hamas was going to come and kill them if they used them. Now that's happening in Israel, inside a so-called refugee camp called Shuafat. And even so, they can't do anything about the Hamas creeps. So, there's lots of people out there who mean well, but you've heard enough to see what some of the challenges are, I think. So, Jean, can you show that other screen, please? Just for 2 minutes. I know it's a challenge, but if you can do it, it'd be good. I just, oh, you can't see it. It's too small. Shoot. I just want to thank David Bedeen, because without him, half my UNRWA education would not exist. And he's always been really nice about sharing his films. And I think I even put a name of, maybe I'll send you ladies in Canada an email with all this information, and you can spread it around a little bit.
I think that would be wonderful, Joan.
Yeah,
if,
I think that's what I'll do. But I just want to thank him, my friend Elise, who asked me not to use her last name or anything, and my college friend whose mother said, don't you dare put her phone number on the screen. And then there's a lady named Ann Baevsky, who I absolutely adore, but most of her topics did not fit in my hour. And she's at a website called humanrightsvoices.org, which I highly recommend. If you read Behind the News, oh, he even gave you his email, David Bedin at Behind the News, and you read her, you'll know what the right-wingers, I don't know why they call us right-wingers, but I think we're liberals who want to save all these kids from being martyred. Anyway, if you read those two people and then you add Melanie Phillips, you'll have a great education. So thank you for listening.
Okay. Well, again, Joan, with all these resources, I'm just to let everyone know, we will definitely share this information
Yes.
because you've been just a plethora of, and maybe I'll just ask one more question from Rhea Hoffman, who has the power to dissolve UNRWA?
Say that again. Who has the power to dissolve UNRWA? That's actually more complicated than it should be, because UNRWA is not just a UN financed entity. You have to follow the money and all this stuff. UNRWA is supported about 20% by the UN directly. The rest of its money comes from donor nations, of which the United States of America has always been the most generous, except, God bless him, when Donald Trump was in office, they didn't get a single penny, not one. And same with Iran, by the way. He never gave Iran any money either. But otherwise, we pay. Right now, we're on a hold. We're holding up our payments till March. But every week, I get another email about how it's probably going to start. They're probably going to start paying in the new year. So there you go. So because of that, how can you dissolve them? You have to go into this whole budget, and then you'll have a whole bunch of sweet little old Palestinian ladies crying, but where's my child going to go to school? Who's going to pay my son to pump gas? I mean, they don't just run schools. UNRWA was formed to make housing, towns, everything. So it's really a problem. There's no question about it. And I think that it's very important that all of us do what we can. If you know any journalists at sort of regular papers who might write an article about some of this, definitely let us know. I have this whole group at the UN. One of us can write an article on almost anything. So that's something we should definitely try to do, because, well, the New York Times is impossible. The Wall Street Journal is a little bit better. So there you go. I don't know how the papers are in Canada. Do you have a paper that would be pro-Israel?
I don't think it's my liberty to say so at this point. But what I will say is that I think we've sort of gone over our time limit, Joan. You've been
that's fine.
Absolutely incredible. But I'm going to pass it over to Monica, who is again, part of the National Anti-Semitism Committee, Monica Simon, and is VP at National Council of Jewish Women of Canada. Monica?
Hi, Monica.
Hello. Joan, thank you for your informative, albeit very shocking, and most insightful presentation.
You're welcome.
Your suggestions, how we all can, as individuals and organizations, help to end anti-Semitism and promote peace, are most appreciated. Thank you also to our audience for attending this evening's webinar. And with that, I wish you all a good evening and good night.